Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us for today's presentation about replacing your web content management system in 2019. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the sales team here with the Real Story Group, and our founder, Tony Byrne, will be joining us momentarily to take us through the heart of today's presentation. But I just wanted to introduce myself, and for those of you that are new to Real Story Group, introduce you to us as well. First, a couple of housekeeping items of note. If you have questions at any point during today's presentation, you can enter those in the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. And also for the attendees on the line, you'll be receiving a copy of the slide deck within the next couple of days from our marketing team. And then for the subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of the presentation in your subscriber library. And our subscribers are really the lifeblood of our business. And again, for those of you who do subscribe, we appreciate you joining us for today's presentation. And for those that don't, here's a quick overview of the different offerings that we have available. There's really three different levels of access that we have to our subscriptions, which are it's a self-service model, first and foremost, where you have access to Real Story Group's research and tools to create custom shortlists and compare the vendors side by side with each other. So you could subscribe to our web content management research as an example, or several different markets we cover. We also offer a guided solution where you get a number of hours of advisory time with analysts like Tony to really put a real world experience behind the research and give you that hand holding, so to speak, as you're looking to make a technology selection and stay abreast of the marketplace and the trends and how they might impact you. The third level is our guided subscription, which also includes a number of templates and RFP assistance. So we can certainly walk you through those different models if you're interested in taking a look at the subscription. So we'll have our contact info at the end to provide you with some more guidance around that. What's different about Real Story Group, for those of you that are new to us, is the fact that we really don't do any work for the vendors we cover. And as far as we know, we're the only research organization has taken this approach. So we don't speak at their conferences or write white papers for them. We're only concerned with the products and whatever is most important to you as a technology user and buyer. And here's a look at the markets we cover. You'll notice that we have this in the form of a subway map where you'll see the blue line, the light blue line is web content and experience management, which we're going to focus on today. We also cover a number of other areas around digital asset management, marketing automation. The latest offering is customer data platforms. And you're welcome to download excerpts from this research at any time. So certainly after the presentation today, we welcome you to do that. As I mentioned, our founder, Tony Byrne, is on the line with us, and he's going to take us through today's presentation. So Tony, let me hand things over to you.
Hey, thanks, Scott. So welcome, everyone. This light blue line, web content and experience management, is near and dear to certainly to my mind. I founded Real Story Group in 2001, originally a CMS watch. So I've been participating or watching this field really since 1996. The first CMSs came out in 1994. So they've been around for a while. We're up on like a 25-year anniversary, and I think it's safe to say that the industry has matured. It's certainly changing a lot. We changed our name 10 years ago to Real Story Group when we started covering other technologies, but really it was this idea that there was some such thing as a static quadrant that got me to found CMS Watch in the first place. This idea that there are inherently, fundamentally winners and losers in this space. And as an implementer of these tools in the late 90s, I realized that really wasn't true, that it's really a question of what's the right fit for you. And so that's a key word that we're going to be repeating a lot today and in every webinar that we have, which is what's the right fit for your particular organization. And you certainly won't find that in any kind of a static quadrant. So let's talk about the agenda for today. If we're looking at WCM in 2019, what are some enduring trends that we're seeing? In other words, things that have been happening for several years and are continuing to happen in 2019. But then what's shifting this year? What are some of the more kind of tectonic forces that we see in this marketplace and among these tools? And that's really then a good setup for really describing, should you switch? Should you switch in 2019? Should you be looking at new technologies? Maybe you've got the wrong incumbent. Maybe there's some new capabilities that you can and should be looking for. And then what does it mean to explore your alternatives, and how do you get the right shortlist for your particular enterprise? And as Scott mentioned, we'll definitely have time for Q&A. So feel free to pose any questions, comments, critiques, what have you, in the questions tab of your GoToWebinar control panel. Okay, so let's get into it first. WCM Marketplace, Circa 2019. We really look at this marketplace on a complexity spectrum. So you have the most complex on the far left and the simpler ones on the far right. This is not a value judgment at all. In fact, we know that most of you are likely to overbuy this technology rather than underbuy it. And so we're not suggesting that the ones on the left are somehow better. They're just going to have, as we note down here, more native richness. They're going to be more customizable and extensible, but they're also going to be more complex, more developer intensive, and clearly have longer-term total cost of ownership. So we've got toolkits in the far left, Adobe, Sitecore, SDL, Tridian, these sort of upper range vendors that are probably slightly less complex than the toolkits. Mid-range is a very popular space right now, still mid-range platforms. And then, of course, simpler on the right. Legacy tools we have in the lower left. These are typically systems that you leave rather than license afresh. So a couple of sort of enduring trends here. This marketplace has always been, and I believe will continue to be, highly fragmented. That's good because that means you have a lot of choices. We are seeing greater complexity among these tool sets, both in terms of the user interfaces and the breadth of capabilities that they're trying to smush into WCM. This is actually a bit of an issue because it's also making them more developer intensive. So for anything from the mid-range on over to the left, you really are going to need at least one in-house developer, close at hand, let alone potentially working with outside consultants as well. Seeing some business model convergence where these vendors are typically building implementation channel partners, although with some exceptions, and they're also coming up with their own platform as a service models as well, where they host the platform themselves in some sort of a cloud environment and then charge you an annual subscription for that. Again, we tend to see more platform as a service rather than cloud native software as a service, although that's changing a little bit as well. So these are just some, what's going on in the marketplace today. But now let's look at things that we see kind of shifting this year specifically. And there's a number of examples that I'm going to cite here. So first of all is we think that there's going to be more of a desire to reduce complexity, I think particularly editorial complexity. We're not there yet, but I think vendors sense that this is a problem, that they've been building these sophisticated dashboards for editors and marketers, and now this is proving overwhelming, particularly for those who don't live in the platform all day long. The second trend we're seeing is to externalize personalization and segmentation, which is another way of saying that increasingly these systems have to rely on this kind of logic and data coming from somewhere else. We think this is a really important trend and something for you to be thinking about as well. I wish the vendors were actually more flexible in this regard, but it's definitely coming. And we're going to see more editorial fluidity where content drives the experience. And I think this has been a constant, tension really for the last 25 years between content managers and experience managers. I think now we all understand that really content should drive the experience. The editorial interfaces weren't always like that. What you see here on the left is Project Gutenberg, an attempt to overhaul the default WordPress editorial interface with a more medium-like block style editorial interface where you can have arbitrary broad blocks. Unfortunately, those blocks aren't actual individualized addressable components. That's a bit of an issue in WordPress, but the intent, I think, is very clear, and we're seeing this in other platforms as well. This more flexibility for the editors to shape, not necessarily recraft the template as a whole, but to shape the editorial experience in the body of any kind of narrative, so that the content is driving that experience rather than some preset, really restricted set of fields. Then the next trend is what we're seeing as head optional. And so this, of course, relates to the headless versus traditional coupled CMS. So I think there's been a lot of excitement around headless, this idea that I can put content out that doesn't necessarily have to go out through my web content management system, that there's a number of other systems that I'm engaging the customer with. And so I can put this content into applications, into different channels, of course, across devices. There's some issues with this approach that comes up sometimes after you start implementing a headless system, which is that you want to start knowing where is this content actually used? How can I preview and simulate the experience? How can I syndicate more than just content, but actually syndicate micro experiences? And it turns out that's harder than it first looks. And then, of course, what about managing a good old marketing site? They still matter, although they may be less important each year. You still want to have those. And so in a headless platform, I'm kind of taking the experience potentially out of the hands of the content and experience managers and putting it forward in a kind of an application. And then that, creates a sort of lack of intimacy that we've been fighting to achieve over the last 25 years. So we're suggesting, and I think the vendors are really aligning around this too, particularly the established vendors, that what you really want are head optional, where I can go headless with a proper REST content and robust REST-based content API, as well as to be able to manage the look and feel of a more traditional website within the CMS. So I want both, right? That's what's happening in 2019. I think the bigger question here that really we're sort of begging in this whole webinar is, should you switch, right? Should you be looking at a new platform? And, you should ABL, always be looking, keep your eyes on the marketplace. It certainly, as we know, is shifting. There's a couple things to say here. And first is, there's a more generic checklist that you always want to go through, which we've been using this now for more than a decade. And it's really 10 telltale signs of a failing vendor or a failing open source project or a failing technology. And so this is a little bit of a kind of a Cosmo quiz treatment. But if we go back here, and look at these 10, significant fall off in new customers, declining community events or no community events, which can be a killer, disrupted product support, serial acquisition. So that means that this tool is being selected, or is being bought and then bought again. There's obviously clearly a problem there. But rapid vendor staff turnover, what we call an escaped open source, so a commercial platform that then makes itself open source with the hopes of kind of reviving some energy from the user community. Slower product updates clearly can be an issue. Invasive account reps, you just can't tell you what's going on. Certainly meandering roadmaps, and obviously distracted founders. Now, some of these things can also be characteristic of a startup, so you can't say, well, any one or two of these in and of themselves is really going to be a prohibitive problem. But what we say is, if you see one or two of these, remain vigilant. 3 to 5, you don't necessarily have to go to the exits, but you need a solid plan B, which is, okay, if something really, nosedives here, where are we going to go next? And if you see 6 to 10 of these, then it's really a good sign to start locating your nearest exit. So if under your existing WCM platform, if you're seeing 6 to 10 of these, you should definitely be in the marketplace today. Definitely gather the internal resources to figure out how to do a switch on your terms rather than somebody else's terms. So that's a failing vendor. That's not always why you want to switch. I think we see a lot of modernization efforts going on right now. So we see a lot of enterprises in legacy WCM platforms, or they heavily customize a certain platform such that they have forked themselves and they don't have a reasonable path for an upgrade. And to stay on that platform means it's going to be a total rebuild. And if I'm going to totally rebuild, then really I should also look at my alternatives, right? So this is probably the bigger reason why we see in 2019 individual enterprises switching their WCM platform. It's really in an effort to modernize. And there's really 4 key things here that we see enterprises looking for. First is a more modern editorial user experience. So first and foremost, the block level flexibility that we saw earlier. This notion of collaboration over workflow. A lot of legacy WCM platforms have these kind of rigid editorial process-based workflows that came out of the document management world that really aren't quite right for publishing, which we find to be more collaborative, more ad hoc, certainly a lot more flexibility, the concept of more norms and fewer rules. And other niceties as well, like the ability to curate automated lists. So if I want to show the top 5 related articles based on metadata, I might want to pin one of those or reorder that list. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to syndicate micro content and micro experiences to other environments besides my default marketing website, increasingly an urgent requirement across really all the different segments, all the different industry verticals that we see. And this is what a modern editorial UX should give you. Then the other thing, too, is kind of related to 4, which is that your WCM platform increasingly needs to live in a broader engagement stack that's going to have a lot of other tool sets. And we'll talk about that in a second. But what that implies is that you need to have, the WCM package needs to have an integration framework and ideally some mature connectors. And this is where we see a real dividing line between WCM vendors and open source projects that have taken this very seriously and those that haven't, which is the ability to have a framework for not just make every connection a one-off, but have a framework for being able to have bidirectional data and content and events move from your WCM platform to others, and ideally some pre-built connectors that I can then extend. And the third reason you may want to modify, or you may want to modernize, is to take advantage of a broad ecosystem. We find this is really an important predictor of the overall health of any technology, is the richness, the depth, the maturity of the ecosystem around that particular technology. So being able to connect up with other customers in person or virtually, to take advantage of a broad array of external developers as independent experts or even formal integration partners, and certainly consultants who are experienced with this. So this, for example, is one of the benefits of some of the larger open source platforms, is the sheer diversity of the community around them. Of course, many commercial vendors have also tapped into this sort of energy as well, but the community may in fact be going in a different direction than you, but even then, that's the way it's kind of, at least I'm understanding what's happening here. So it's more than just the vendor, it's the community that you're looking for in a more modern environment. And the fourth one is a little bit controversial. We've been talking about this now for several months, and it's this idea that more likely in your future, your WCM platform is going to have more modest scope, where you're going to have other systems do the thinking for you in an omni-channel world. This is actually an opportunity for you, because what this means is that you might be able to license a simpler WCM tool rather than a more complex and costly one. So if we look at this, this is our customer digital engagement reference model, where you've got major channels at the top, and then you've got some production interaction, delivery services, like portals, communities, maybe mobile middleware, and so forth. And then you've got these content and engagement management systems, and you can see that WCM is really just one of 4 potentially other key engagement management platforms, each of which are to some extent a silo. This is obviously an issue. So there are efforts to, underneath that, to build more enterprise foundation services, one of which, for example, is a customer data platform. So your WCM vendor might say, as Episerver and Sitecore and Acquia and others, that, hey, your WCM platform can be your customer data platform. You really don't want to do that. You really want your customer data to live underneath all of these content and engagement management systems, so that all of your different systems can tap into it, enrich it, and leverage that customer data, so you can have a more consistent single view of the customer, and the customer ideally can have a more single, consistent experience working with your enterprise across channels. This is just one example of why your WCM, hopefully going forward, can be a kind of a thinner and simpler player in your stack. Still important for creating that final aggregated experience on websites and potentially mobile devices, but is not as intelligent or data-rich a platform, because you're moving some data and some intelligence lower in your stack. So this is actually, I think, a good thing for you. And if you're considering some of the upper range WCM vendors, you should also then consider some of the mid-market or mid-complexity tier WCM vendors as well. Okay, so that's why you might want to consider switching. So switching to what? As we mentioned before, it's a highly fragmented marketplace. You've got a lot of alternatives. How do you start thinking about these tools? Well, the traditional way to do this is to look at features, right? And in our research, we certainly divide potential web content management services into three categories. I won't read through this whole list, but roughly they fall into technology services, content services, and experience services. Now, this doesn't mean that every WCM platform should have all of these services. In fact, I'm suggesting that a number of the experience services and potentially some of the content services should be done by other tools. But this is a potential universe of capabilities. The problem with this model is that it gets you out of a more human-oriented selection process into kind of a more bloodless, checklist-based selection process. And we know from the world of design thinking that's not the way to go about technology decision-making. So this is useful, and we use this list ourselves, but this isn't actually decisive in helping you understand what's a good fit. So one of the things that we've done in our own evaluations at Real Story Group is to focus more on canonical usage scenarios and strategic considerations, and I would encourage you to do the same thing. So let's talk about usage scenarios first. On the left, for web content management, we have 10 of them. This is our evaluation of TeamSite, the former Interwoven Autonomy HP platform, now part of OpenText. And we take these 10 scenarios and say, look, what is TeamSite good at? It turns out it's got some real issues here. As you can see, it doesn't score very highly. But the purpose here is to actually talk about what you're trying to do in a business context and then matching that up against what the vendor can do. So you really want your selection process to be use case based with real personas actually getting things done. We already know from the UX world that this is the way to make tech decisions. It's just very often we don't do it ourselves. We may do this for our customers. We don't always use this methodology ourselves. And of course, we're suggesting that you apply a use case based approach. That's what we do in our vendor evaluations. On the right, there's also strategic considerations. So these are really important things around the vendor, the product, and the ecosystem. What are some of the other strategic considerations that you want to have in mind when you're selecting a tool? And there's always trade-offs here. We tend to find that, for example, with startups, you may find a very rich modern product, and so you see a lot of good product intangibles, but often weak vendor and ecosystem intangibles. Whereas with very, very mature vendors, we often see strong ecosystem, potentially strong vendor, but often weak and aging product with a lot of technical debt. So these are the things that you also really want to understand as well before you make this decision. Now, the good news is that we've set this up for you as an actual application. So you can use that methodology with what we call real quadrant. And this is to generate not a magic quadrant, but a real quadrant that's dynamic, that's based on your unique requirements. What are your scenarios and how much do you want to weight them? And what are the strategic considerations that are important to you? And how do you want to weight those? And then what it does is give you this dynamic quadrant where you can then download all the custom backing research that describes the pros and cons of the different vendors and allows you to sort of navigate this marketplace, get into all the rich details that we have, all the gotchas about the different tools, all their real weaknesses that they'll never tell you. It's all there behind it, but this gives you a way of building quickly a short list to get you to just the information that you need that can drive a really good decision. So to get you to a short list and then tell you the strengths and weaknesses of those vendors. Okay, so some takeaways. First of all, WCM tools have been growing in complexity. This is being driven by us, the customer, but we think this is potentially a dark alley in the emerging kind of omni-channel world, which is that what's going to happen going forward is probably the scope of WCM is going to get narrower, and so you don't want to have that complexity out towards the edge. You want to have that complexity lower in your stack in enterprise foundation services. And the good news is that if you are in the market for WCM, you can probably get a simpler one. There's definitely some good reasons to consider switching in 2019. Your vendor or your platform has plateaued or become too high risk. You want a modern editorial UX. You want better integration with the rest of your stack and potentially a simpler and lower cost solution that can still get you a lot of value, but do so in a way that allows for more flexibility going forward. So you have a lot of plausible alternatives. And you saw how fragmented that marketplace is. There's new entrants. We're going to be evaluating some new players this year, certainly. But you want to be sure to evaluate them against your specific needs and opportunities. In other words, not against some generic quadrant or some kind of Yelp-like rating site, but really to understand what are the things that are really critical for you and how does that match up against the vendor profile. Obviously, this is an area where we would be delighted to help you out. We've been publishing this particular set of evaluations for 18 years. It's been really interesting watching this whole space evolve. There have been some things that haven't changed, some things clearly that have. 2019, as we mentioned, a lot of interesting developments happening in this marketplace. So feel free to go to our website and try out a sample and learn what the real weaknesses and strengths are of these 30-odd tools that we cover. So with that, we're going to look over some of the questions you have. There's still time to ask questions in the Go to Webinar Control Panel. But I'll turn it over to Scott real quickly while we do that about next steps.
Great, thanks, Tony. And again, this deck will be shared with you over the next coming days from our marketing team. And for subscribers, you'll be able to access a recording of the presentation in your subscriber library when that's available. As Tony mentioned, you're welcome to reach out to us at any time at explore@realstorygroup.com. And what we actually recommend is taking a look at the research either for the web content management space or any other markets we cover. You're welcome to download excerpts from all those different research areas. You can also try out the tools such as Real Quadrants and Real Time, so you create your own custom shortlist. And then if you ever want to see a behind the scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience, drop us a line and we'd be happy to schedule a 15 to 20 minute presentation with you. So with that, Tony, looks like there may be one or two questions here for you.
Okay, great. You want to just read them off? I'm having a little bit of trouble with my GoToWebinar control panel today.
Okay, absolutely. The first one was just about the deck being shared. So actually, it looks like we are able to get that one. And then let me just see if there are others. Actually, that was the only one that came in.
Okay, the question we very often get is, where is Microsoft in all this? Because back in the day, SharePoint did have some footprint in not just intranet websites, but also public-facing websites. And the key thing here is Microsoft has essentially exited this market. With SharePoint, I think it was pretty much acknowledged even by all of their partners, and certainly as we tracked it, going all the way back to 2003, that we are arguing you should never ever use it for a marketing-oriented website. And people that did typically came to grief. With the advent of Office 365, Microsoft explicitly said, don't publish public-facing websites on this platform, and turned that off. Still kind of keeping the lights on a little bit as far as intranet sites. Certainly with SharePoint, their goal is really to help corporate communicators spread messages and then try to push you into more collaborative environments in your digital workplace. So Microsoft is really kind of AWOL still. There's rumors that they may acquire a public-facing WCM firm right now. I think if they would have, they probably would have already. And so it looks like their eyes are elsewhere. And also I think the fact that IBM has not paid close attention to this and now has kind of sold off their WebSphere franchise, and Oracle also still nominally selling different capabilities here, but their attention elsewhere. OpenText essentially kind of a convalescence center for older WCM platforms. So some of the major ECM vendors and collaboration vendors have really stayed out of this space. Salesforce also declining to participate after killing off their own WCM. So that's left this big wide open field for all these pure play suppliers, both commercial and open source and commercial open source. And so it's a really interesting, vibrant, diverse marketplace. It's certainly been fascinating to watch, and we'd be happy to advise you going forward on these sorts of decisions that you need to make in 2019.
We did have one other one come in, Tony, around IBM as a legacy platform. It sounds like there's a product about Watson Content Hub, which is aligned to some of the aspects you mentioned.
Yeah. So Watson Content Hub is interesting. It is a kind of a combination component management and system and DAM. We're going to start covering it actually under our DAM research. It can also support some narrative content. It's really designed to be a lower level, what we would call content platform that lives underneath all of your other engagement systems. It's not really designed to be a web publishing platform in and of itself. This is an interesting new class of tools. We're going to be covering them in more depth, but I wouldn't use IBM Watson Content Hub as your WCM platform per se. It's designed to support omni-channel chunks of content. It has some strengths and weaknesses in that area, but you wouldn't line it up against, say, the likes of EpiServer or Drupal.
Great. Looks like that was the last one to come in.
Okay, so with that, we've reached the bottom of the half hour. So once again, on behalf of Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne from Real Story Group, thanking you for participating today and looking forward to seeing you again. Bye now.